Without further ado then, I will hand over to Professor David Macdonald to do the formal welcome to our venue. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Wow, what a splendid occasion and how wonderful to see you all here. I suppose I stand before you to welcome you wearing two metaphorical hats. One of them is on behalf, in a sense, of the Oxfordshire Local Nature Partnership. Many of you are involved in that wonderful oversight body which tries to be custodian and nourisher of Oxford's nature, but also to welcome you to our premises here at the WildCRU, as David said. And I feel it's an appropriate place to hold a meeting like this with Oxfordshire and nature at our hearts. In fact, a few moments ago, Claire reminded me that it was perhaps 14 years ago that you collectively, some of you, were here for an earlier lecture where we were making presentations about the work we've been doing on Oxfordshire farmlands and how better to integrate farming and wildlife, a topic that is surely still at the very heart of many of our thoughts. For those of you who aren't familiar with the WildCRU's work, I'll spend just 2 or 3 moments introducing us. We're a research unit within the University of Oxford, the Department of Biology, as it's now known. It was for many years the Department of Zoology. And we have a mission. Our mission is to solve practical problems in conservation through doing fundamental academic research. So we're at the interface between scholarship and application. And actually, although some of you will know us in contexts that are further flung, our work in Africa on lions, for example, the notorious Cecil affair, our work in Southeast Asia on tigers, dholes, clouded leopards, much of it to do with landscape use and change and the integration of human development and human well-being with biodiversity well-being, or perhaps in South America, whether it's jaguars or capybaras. But actually, a very substantial part of what we do is in this country, and indeed in this county, which makes it such a pleasure to welcome you here today. For nearly 40 years, far less than 14 have passed since you were last in this room, we've been engaged with farmland and biodiversity. Some of the work you'll know about. I suppose it was in the mid-80s we started what was then the largest farm-scale experiments in this country to better integrate farming and wildlife in the context of field margins. Work, much of it involving invertebrates, although we're often known for our work on larger organisms, moths in hedgerows and so forth, that influenced what became Natural England's policy and then EU policy on farming and wildlife. Whether it's alien species, invasive species, mink and water voles, or the battles between the American and the endemic crayfish, again, every aspect of wildlife in farmland has been something we've engaged with. Nowadays, we continue to work, as well as the work on badgers that some of you are familiar with policy on, for example, Scottish wildcats, further from Oxford, but nonetheless a UK-based problem. All of these things are united by a strand, which is to generate evidence to inform policy, to lead, one hopes, to action. And I think that's a relationship that it wouldn't surprise me if it doesn't come up when Nat's talking to us later. But nonetheless, for now, that's me done. Welcome. Thank you for coming. I hope we'll all see you here again. But for now, I pass over to the substantive part of the introduction, which is Camilla.
Thank you so much, David. And whilst Camilla's being mic'd up, you may have noticed we've got a couple of cameras. For the last 3 years, just through COVID, all of our annual lectures have been on Zoom, and so we've been able to record those, and if you wish, you can still see our previous talks online. It's great to be back to face-to-face, but it's also good that other folk who aren't able to come will be able to watch today's talk. So a big shout out to to Nathalie Schaefer, who's filming us today. And I'm sure many of you have actually seen Nathalie's work because she did the amazing Even Load film and our WildCRU film as well. They're really excellent showcases of our work. So, suitably mic'd up, I'm going to hand over to Camilla.
Great, thank you, David. So I'm just going to take you through a quick summary of what Wild Oxfordshire have been up to in the last 12 months or so, before we then hear from Nathalie. So as you may be aware, Wild Oxfordshire is all about bringing people together and enabling to do the best thing for nature on their patch, whether that's a patch of land or within their sphere of influence, within a business or within a local authority or government organisation. So we don't own any land or nature reserves. We're all about inspiring and advising people to take action for nature on their land. And we work with all sorts of people. We work with over 100 community nature groups, 80 conservation organisations, lots of businesses, landowners, and thousands of individuals. We work at 3 scales across Oxfordshire. So first of all, at the Oxfordshire wide scale, we bring together all of those working and volunteering in conservation, and also those interested in contributing to nature's recovery. So we're a very active member of Oxfordshire Local Nature Partnership, which David mentioned earlier. I'm the vice chair on the board there, and I've got one of the seats representing environmental NGOs, so I also ensure that I'm talking to all the other environmental charity leaders about what the important things are at that moment, so we can try and work together. And we've also been working this year very closely with Oxfordshire County Council on the local nature recovery strategy, which is essentially the big plan of what we need to do to achieve nature recovery in Oxfordshire. And then we also work on the landscape scale for the delivery, or the actual action takes place there. So we host the Even Load Catchment Partnership, which is based around the River Even Load, and also the Yellow Wagtail Partnership and the Curlew Recovery Partnership as well, which are all based around bringing people together around species or particular geographic areas to work together on nature. And then thirdly, we work at the local scale, so supporting community nature groups in their parish or village or town to take action for nature on their patch, engage with schools and parish and town councils so that they can all be working together on creating more space for nature. And we have curated information on our website, so guidance for all different audiences, ecological guidance which is specific to Oxfordshire, and we also have a monthly email bulletin, newsletters twice a year. We have lots of in-person events as well, and of course all the social media as well. So if you haven't already, then do follow us on social media and come and join in real life as well. So I won't dwell on this for too long because I think that probably all the people in the room and the people who might be watching the video later already know why we need to take action, and that's why you're all involved. But we know we're in the middle of a biodiversity emergency and nature's declined massively over the last 70 years. We've got less space for nature, species populations are declining, and habitats are becoming degraded and fragmented. But nature can help with all of these things and also with the issue of climate change as well. So we know that average temperatures are going to exceed 1.5 degrees, but nature can really help with that. So 23 million tonnes of carbon is stored in Oxfordshire's soils and vegetation, and 115,000 tonnes is sequestered each year. So nature can provide us with a whole host of services which are essential to our survival and many of the solutions to climate change as well. So we know that we won't solve the climate crisis without achieving nature's recovery, and then we'll also get all the other benefits from nature as well, so the intrinsic value of nature, also the benefits to our health and well-being, and others. So it sort of seems to make sense to me that we need to all work together on nature. So as I mentioned earlier, I think it's really important that we have a framework or a county-wide strategy for nature recovery that we can all be working towards, whatever scale we're working at, whether we're at the local scale, the landscape scale, the county-wide scale. And this year we've been working very closely with Oxfordshire County Council on the local nature recovery strategy. So we're involved in all the working groups and on the steering group, and we also chair the engagement and comms group. And one of the big achievements has been that at the recent consultation at the end of last year, we had over 2,000 responses. And in other counties, they had about maximum of 400 responses, and some places they only had 20 to 30 responses. So it was a massive increase in the number of people involved in the consultation. So that was a really big achievement. And then the final local nature recovery strategy will be published in autumn 2025, and then we'll be able to move on with the delivery, although of course acknowledging that everyone's already doing delivery already, but we want to try and increase that. As I mentioned earlier, we also host the Yellow Wagtail Partnership, which is a partnership between Earth Trust, Church Farm and Lower Farm, and that's all about looking at how they can work together to manage their land along the River Thames so that it provides more habitat for yellow wagtails and other farmland birds, and importantly, more insects, which is what they feed on. We've also been hosting the Curlew Recovery Project since 2021. That's focused on identifying where curlews are and then fencing their nests so that they're safe from predators. And the approach that we've taken with this project is to train up a whole host of volunteers so that they're able to find the nests, fence them and also monitor them. And the benefit of that is that rather than one single project officer having all those skills, we've managed to spread that out between, I think, up to at least 10 volunteers. And this year we were able to actually pay them for their time because they'd reached that skill level where we could do that and we had the funding for that. So this really fits with our ethos of trying to empower more people to act for nature, and means that there's more people available to continue this project into the future. One of our main areas of work is our community ecology programme, where we support community nature groups and parish and town councils to create space for nature in their local area. This year we've given on-site advice to 14 groups and 21 parish councils on things like orchards, road verges, meadows, churchyards and planting for pollinators. And we've also rejuvenated, with the help of loads of volunteers, over 400 people, we've rejuvenated 500 metres of hedgerow and planted over 2.5 kilometres. So that's 3 kilometres of awesome hedgerow, which now exists thanks to the funding we got from CPRE and the hard work of all the local people who joined in. And we've also done lots of training for those people. And again, it's all about enabling them to take this hedgerow planting and management forward into the future. It would be much easier to just pay some contractors to stick all the trees in the ground and then cut them every so often. But what we really want to do is empower more people to be able to do these things. We also updated our community, town and parish guide to nature. So that's available on our website. And we had a brilliant local environment groups conference which was all about linking up nature with hedgerows and verges. And we talked there about how there was, local nature groups that we also heard from the Evenlode Catchment Partnership, and we also heard from the farmer cluster in the same area. So it's all about how all of those different groups were contributing to the tapestry of nature recovery. And it doesn't matter whether you're, a local person in a community group or a farmer in a farmer cluster or the Environment Agency or Thames Water or a landowner working in a catchment partnership. Everyone's contributing to this bigger picture. So there's about 100 community nature groups working across Oxfordshire, and you can find them all on the map on our website. We're also working towards moving to a new kind of map, so you may have had emails from us about that. The new map will be more easily searchable. Another really big part of our work is the Evenlode Catchment Partnership. So there are several catchment partnerships across Oxfordshire, and we host the one around the River Evenlode. And this year has been the final year of the Smarter Water Catchments programme, which was funded by primarily Thames Water, but also Environment Agency. Just during the last year, we've engaged with 6 new landowners, created 3 wetlands, removed a weir that was blocking fish passage, constructed 2 natural flood management bunds, 8 leaky woody dams. Our partners have delivered 39 school sessions in 20 schools for 849 children, so that's almost 1,000 children. And we've also, our partners Earth Watch have been enabling citizen scientists to monitor 32 sites for water quality, which is way more than the Environment Agency would be able to do. We also created, with Nicola, who's recording us today, a international award-winning film called Beneath the Surface, which is all about the Evenlode catchment partnership. And they also launched a new website. So it's actually crazy how much the Evenlode catchment partnership has managed to achieve in the last year. There's not really time for me to talk about everything that everyone's achieved in Wild Oxfordshire with all of our partners and with all of the people that we work with. But there's a lot more information on our website. All of our projects now have films about them as well, if you'd rather watch a short film. And we also have our annual review available over here, again with some highlights. We already know there are loads of people across Oxfordshire already taking action for nature. Community nature groups, parish and town councils, farmers, schools, businesses and landowners of all types and all sizes of land. So none of the things that we've achieved would be possible without the hard work and dedication of all of the team in Wild Oxfordshire, our staff, our trustees, our volunteers, our supporters, and all of the people who are simply sort of getting on with creating space for nature wherever they are. So thank you to everyone who has contributed to nature recovery in the last year, and I hope that we can continue to do that going forward and involve more and more people, because that's what we need to do. So yes, I think if we just continue and enable more and more people to do that, then we will achieve nature recovery in Oxfordshire. We have to do that before I retire. That's my aim. So yeah, I mentioned before we've got lots of different ways that we communicate information. So do keep in touch with us and keep up to date with what's going on. Our news is all about Wild Oxfordshire and other organisations as well. So we don't just talk about what we're achieving. And if you're able to support our work, that'd be brilliant. Again, there are lots of different ways that you can do that. Regular donations, one-offs, volunteering, spreading the word about what we do. And coming up in April, we will have a fundraising campaign for the Evenlode Catchment Partnership to secure funding for 2025 onwards. So keep an eye out for that. We'd much appreciate your contributions. If you're able to chip in, then that would be fantastic. So yeah, that's all for me. Thanks.
Great, thank you.
A reminder that our previous annual lectures are available on YouTube. So in 2022, we had Professor Dieter Helm. In 23, we had John T. Brunye from FarmEd. And last year, we had Richard Benwell, who's the Chief Executive of Wildlife and Countryside Link. They're all excellent talks. And please do join YouTube and subscribe to our channel, like our videos, leave a comment, and that will help the algorithms drive other business to us. So, and I'll be pleased to watch Nathalie's talk again. So for 2025, I'm sorry, just get me names right. So in 2025, Nathalie will be presenting our talk as the founding director for nature-based solutions at the University of Oxford. And one of the ways that I met Nathalie was recently at a event, Nature Conversations, very clever play on the word conservation and conversation, which was effectively a citizens' assembly to look at nature spaces in Oxford City. And in 22-23, Nathalie, you were part of the first ever national assembly, so as the academic lead, and well worth looking up that project and the outcomes of it. I had a quick look, and I was really interested in, under leadership and vision, there was a role for NGOs. And so NGOs were called upon to, as charities and NGOs, to lead on agreeing a collective pathway to protecting nature as trusted organisations with extensive grassroots support and with reach into communities. And I thought, wow, that's what Wild Oxfordshire does, so hooray. But it was really, really interesting to see that work. And I think that sort of active democracy through those activities is one way that we can begin to sort of repair nature and, I guess, work against the short-term cycle of governments and their elections. So, Nathalie, I welcome you to give our annual lecture. Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to give this talk. It's lovely to be here. It's always wonderful to come to Tubney, especially on a sunny day, but also really humbled by everything I'm learning about Wild Oxfordshire. I really think that what's happening is very solid and wonderful, and I love all the engagement with communities, and I do agree with you that the sort of the growing movement and strength behind the sort of the Citizens' Assembly for nature and for climate and these other critical issues are really important. So it was great to meet you again there and learn a little even more about Wild Oxfordshire. So I suppose my talk's going to be a bit sort of higher level in a sense of a bit more of a global look and a little bit more conceptual in some ways, but it will ultimately, I hope, be grounded in reality and action on the ground, which obviously we need to scale up now more than ever. And I suppose one of my sort of overarching things I'm wanting to discuss today is that it just, last year was the hottest year on record. We've got, growing evidence, as if we really needed it, that biodiversity is declining, is plummeting, in some taxonomic groups is approaching rates of extinction that we haven't seen, since the last mass extinction and so on. But I think at this time, conservationists and ecologists have a really crucial role to play to lean in to policy, to really try and shape things. Because, that understanding of how nature works and what it feels like to be part of nature is so important to help us try and shift some of the narratives, the dominant narratives in our culture and Western culture that really enable the ongoing destruction of that which we depend on for everything. So it's really great to be talking to you and with your expertise of what's really going on locally and what good looks like at the local level. So forgive me for flipping over a couple of slides. I have a slightly shorter time frame in which to speak. And anyway, some of the slides that I might have gone on, now I've seen the Oxfordshire presentation, I think I don't need to sort of discuss what good looks like when it comes to nature conservation, because you all know that very, very well. This talk's going to have these sort of three broad parts. I'm going to talk about nature-based solutions as a concept, as a broad framing that's recently gained quite a lot of traction. The power and utility and usefulness of that, but also some of the really critical pitfalls that we need to address and the need to transform, certainly in political discourse and in the funding space, both on the private sector funding and public sector funding, how we need to transform how nature-based solutions are understood. So I'm going to talk about that in the first part. Talk about this sort of the need to get beyond incrementalism and in how we're tackling some of the big challenges that we face. How we avoid the situation where we're pouring all our efforts into what is effectively papering over the cracks, whilst elsewhere in our economy we're pouring fuel on the flames of the fire. What can we do about that? And what is the role of nature conservation and restoration in actually enabling system change itself? So I want to sort of explore that idea with you, and then how this then speaks to an emerging research and practice agenda. If we have time, we'll get into that. As a researcher based across the departments of biology and geography, I'm always thinking about how, what more evidence do we need? What kinds of evidence do we need to try and shift the dialogue so that we can eventually have an economy that is in service of that which we love, in service of well-being, in service of the web of life, whereas rather than continuing to degrade it. And one of my sort of another kind of critical idea I want to explore today is that I think that there's a lot of alignment between ecological principles. So I'm an ecologist by training. I've been working on applied ecology and issues at the intersection of climate change and biodiversity loss for a few years now. But I'm an ecologist, but I see there's a great synergy and harmony between sort of Western ecological principles and local and Indigenous knowledge. These are two different knowledge systems that have huge amounts of alignment. And when we bring them together, we can potentially transform how we approach conservation, locally, nationally and internationally, and into doing transformed society. But before I get into that, we'll just step back. So nature-based solutions, it was a term that was coined actually by the World Bank in 2008. It was embraced by the IUCN. It became a core part of their program. But it's really only in the last sort of 5 to 10 years that we've seen this huge increase in the use of the word in policy, discourse, in the private sector, in the research community. But put very simply, nature-based solutions involve working with nature as part of it, enhancing it, to address societal goals. Now that societal goal might be food security, water security, climate change adaptation, disaster risk reduction, health crises, whatever it is. It's a societal challenge, but it's a way of working with nature that brings benefits to biodiversity and local communities, locally where those interventions take place, not somewhere else, not as an offset, but where those interventions take place. And that's one of the kind of critical things that you won't forget, but others do overlook when thinking about nature-based solutions. The concept is grounded in decades of research and millennia of Indigenous knowledge that we are supported by nature in countless ways. So that's too countless to describe or to reduce in that way. But that those healthy ecosystems also rely on us in how we interrelate them, how we manage them, how we adaptively manage them, especially in a warming world. I think one of the core ideas behind a nature-based solution too is that, biodiversity loss and climate change do share some same fundamental drivers. Ultimate drivers are exactly the same around separation of ourselves from the natural world, I will argue. But more proximately, for example, on land, industrial agriculture, industrial animal agriculture in particular, is the biggest driver of biodiversity loss on land. It is also an extremely important driver of climate change. 23% of global emissions come from our use and abuse of land, through forestry, through agriculture and so forth. So in theory, you can try and at least go some way towards addressing both crises by more sustainably, more regeneratively looking after our lands, restoration, protection and so forth. But the extent to which you get benefits from nature, or the extent to which nature can support societies or support economies, depends on how you design them, how you implement them, how you finance them, how you govern them, and all these things come together. You don't just get benefits from nature without being very, very careful about how you interrelate with them. So I'm going to skip over a couple of slides which I had on what good looks like, because we've just seen some really beautiful local examples on what good looks like. But this is a diagram that sort of brings some of the key things to bear in mind about nature-based solutions together, which I published a couple of years ago to try and bring some clarity, because there is a lot of confusion about this out there. But we know that basically nature-based solutions are place-based partnerships between people and nature, grounded in biodiversity, led by communities, local organisations and so forth. And if carefully implemented, respecting rights, taking the effects of biodiversity to account, we know that, and there's both local and national and global data sets coming together now, we know that these interventions, conservation, restoration, sustainable management on land and in the sea, can really help build our resilience in the face of climate change. So flood mitigation, cooling in our cities, landslide control, reduction in erosion risks, all sorts of reduced risk from fires, from droughts, all these sorts of things are greatly reduced when we look after and adaptively manage our ecosystems. We know that these activities can support livelihoods and economies, and also they can play some role in sequestering and storing carbon. But there are limits to the extent to which they can support, for example, climate change mitigation, which is sort of set by the biophysical potential, how much land there is, balance rates between, sequestration, photosynthesis and respiration, for example. You've got to take these things into account. Land availability, conflicts with other land uses sort of limit there's a limit to how much climate change benefits, adaptation and mitigation benefits nature can provide. And then even if you have a biophysical estimate of how much benefit they could provide in those ways, then that's limited by what's going on the ground. So there are all sorts of social and cultural and political factors that influence the extent to which a particular intervention can take place where it is. And so your actual potential for nature-based solutions is also shaped by that too. So you've got societal enablers, you've got biophysical potential. But it's really important, and this piece is often overlooked, and I'll come back to this, is that the amount of benefits that you can get from nature is also determined by how much decarbonisation we do, how much climate change we are experiencing. When you've got high climate ambition, so on the graph on the far side of the slide, you can see high climate ambition in the blue colours, where, in other words, emissions come down steeply. You can basically is very good for the biosphere, right? But when we have low climate ambition, as we currently do, or unrealistic climate ambition within our climate change policies, the resultant warming can turn the biosphere into a net source of greenhouse gases from a net sink. But all of this is influenced by anthropogenic stressors, so pollution, fragmentation, degradation of our habitats. And if we manage our habitats very carefully and in an adaptive way, we can build their resilience to some of the impacts of climate change. But you clearly need a lot of decarbonisation alongside nature-based solutions. It's not an either-or. You can't carry on burning fossil fuels if you just plant a few trees. That's very obvious, I'm sure, to this audience, but not so much when not always the case when you're talking to other actors, both on the public and the private sector. There are obviously some sort of two recent publications from our group make two important points. One is that the potential of nature-based solutions to help with cooling very much depends on what part of the world you're looking at. So for a country like the Congo or Brazil, Indonesia, the Philippines, particularly countries like Brazil, where they still have a lot of forest and very low historical emissions, nature-based solutions such as halting deforestation and restoring natural ecosystems can provide up to around 80% of the climate pledge, or can help them that Brazil deliver about 80% of its climate pledge. A country like the UK, with very high historical emissions and very low forest cover in particular, it's a much smaller percentage. And actually, decarbonisation across all sectors of the economy here is vital for us to meet our carbon budget. But that's not to say we don't also need to restore nature because of all the multiple benefits it brings, because we love it, because it also will build our resilience in a warming world. So it's very important for adaptation, not so much for climate change mitigation. So it varies from country to country, which is really important to highlight. This other study, which is going to clearly seeing which way the political winds are blowing at the moment, these kinds of studies are important in the sense that we did this as a systematic review of systematic reviews, showing that if countries invest in nature-based solutions, this will support economic recovery. So we know that nature-based solutions provide all sorts of economic benefits in terms of the ecosystem services they provide, the pollination, the disaster risk reduction, the soil formation, all of those sorts of things. And that's been quite well demonstrated. In fact, globally, nature-based solutions can generate around $125 trillion US. But this was slightly different. This was a study that showed that actually they can generate jobs and have other economic multipliers. So good for economic recovery as well as for avoided economic losses. To all these arguments. As a result, there's been a lot of global traction. This graph here shows the increase in numbers of peer-reviewed papers, including the term nature-based solutions. Nature-based solutions are now embedded in the texts of the United Nations Framework Convention texts of the Convention of Biological Diversity, the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. Most signatories to the Paris Agreement now include nature-based solutions in their climate plans, and there has been a lot of interest in the private sector as well. However, reality check, nature-based solutions are still widely misunderstood, and they have in recent times been reduced to carbon-focused projects such as monoculture tree plantations and offset schemes, or worse, bioenergy carbon capture and storage, BECCS. Many corporate pledges focused on afforestation, so planting trees where trees don't naturally grow, those sorts of projects, without addressing the root cause. So without also doing everything they possibly can to reduce emissions in their supply chains and reduce their dependency on fossil fuels. And we've got there's lots of evidence that the term nature-based solutions has been co-opted by companies using it as a greenwashing tool, masking their ongoing harm to the climate system and the biosphere, and actually delaying action and delaying doing the really hard stuff around reducing demand. And all of this sort of comes from, when driven by the markets alone, nature-based solutions, if they're reduced to this in this way, can cause serious harm. And there are a number of different projects. There's an example here in Cambodia, another one here in Uganda, where old growth natural ecosystems have been replaced with non-native monoculture plantations. Net harm to biodiversity, of course, profound harm to biodiversity. They've often involved land grabs. And many of these projects also don't do well in terms of the carbon either. So those old growth ecosystems are often much better at sequestering and storing carbon than these monoculture plantations that they're replaced with. And there's huge current concern at the moment that a lot of the climate integrated assessment models, which are used as the basis of setting our carbon budgets and our targets, assume global scale up of bioenergy, carbon capture and storage. So growing crops, burning them to generate the energy and storing that carbon at source. They rely on that. And there is a conflation of nature-based solutions with things like BECCS. And the problem with that, biodiversity problems, pollution problems and all of that, it also stops us doing some of the more interesting and innovative stuff of trying to bring our demand down. So as a result of these challenges, some organisations, Friends of the Earth for example, have been really petitioning to abandon the term. So we stop using the term nature-based solutions. There are in some parts of the world, it's causing land grabs and causing these issues. An alternative view is actually, given that nature-based solutions has played quite a big role in getting nature into spaces where nature wouldn't normally be discussed, the treasuries of the room, the boardrooms of major companies, maybe now we're in there, now is the time to release all the ecologists and conservationists from this Trojan horse where we can do our good work. So this is an alternative possibility. We can ensure that policies are based on an ecological integrity, not commercial interests. We can hold governments and businesses to account, say, okay, if businesses have said they're going to invest in nature-based solutions, let's just show them what good looks like and make sure they know that these should be supporting communities, these should be supporting biodiversity, and so forth. Demand social environmental justice, avoiding the land grabs, and try to prevent the greenwashing. And there's been lots of guidelines produced by different organisations to try and, show what good looks like and ensure that integrity and ecological integrity and social integrity is there. In particular, there's the IUCN Global Standard for Nature-Based Solutions, which has was developed through a 2 to 3 year consultation process, and there's now lots of projects all over the world are sort of using the standard and testing it and refining it and improving it. So all this is really good, but as I alluded to at the very beginning of the talk, even if we do this, even if we make sure that those investing in nature-based solutions are also decarbonising and that they are investing in the sorts of projects that we know are going to do a lot of good on the ground, there is this problem of incrementalism. We're living through, this period of, planetary crises. Last year, as I say, hottest year on record. There was this, in the last Living Planet report published towards the end of the last year, reporting 73% declines in the average abundances of vertebrate populations on land. So, our actions really in the global picture are piecemeal and incremental and far too slow, as I say on the slide, to match the urgency of what's needed. So I think the root of cause of our crisis isn't just a lack of political will or funding, it's the economic system itself, I think. As this graph shows, this is the situation. So NGOs have worked incredibly hard, and we now have generating between around 160 and $200 billion of a year of funding to support conservation globally. And this is a lot more than there ever has been. So without seeing these parts of the graph, we think, oh, 200 billion, that's better than nothing. That's quite a lot more than we have. But then when you compare it to the amount that taxpayers' money is pouring into harmful subsidies for fossil fuel and industrial agriculture, and then how much private finance is going in. So there's around $7 trillion a year of private and public finance going into nature destruction and polluting the atmosphere and causing climate change, and only 200 billion. And this is something we need to sort out, right? Current economic system seems to be actively investing in its own demise. It's very reductive, it's very an extractive approach to nature. So this reductive, extractive approach to nature, seeing nature as a resource to be extracted, not taking into account the huge value of nature to society, everything becomes externalized. We can't put a value on nature, so we won't put a value on nature, and we'll treat it as though it's an infinite resource. You're all very aware of this, but this actually contradicts insights from ecology, from Indigenous communities, local knowledge, from systems biology, from quantum physics. None of these systems of thinking, none of these ways of thinking actually see nature as a commodity to be extracted. They don't see it as something separate from humanity. They see humanity as part of nature. So this then leads to the question, can we try and help tackle that problem of incrementalism and the problem with our current economic system, unraveling the web of life, by actually transforming nature-based solutions themselves, given how much traction and attention they now have? So, where do we begin with that? How do we even begin to answer that question? To answer that, I'd like to just briefly turn to those groups who have been most critical of nature-based solutions, especially not in general, but the co-option of nature-based solutions, particularly by the corporate sector. And that is the Indigenous communities of the world. Many Indigenous peoples and local communities are the world's most experienced stewards of biodiversity. I want to now to go to sort of a really, you may well be aware of this, but a very important thing happened in Colombia at COP16. So the Convention of Biological Diversity's Conference of the Party meeting in Cali. And in the news, you read the newspapers, you think, well, actually, it was a disaster, things weren't agreed, but actually some really, really difficult, it's very, very difficult to get all the world's countries to agree on things. And one of the most important things, I think, to emerge from that meeting in Cali was the establishment of this new body, this new organisational framework to enable the full and effective participation of the Indigenous peoples and local communities of the world in the implementation of the coming Montreal Biodiversity Framework. In tandem to that agreement, there was also a really important development, the establishment of the Cali Fund, which states that 50% of revenues generated from digital sequence data, so genetic information, which obviously the agricultural industry uses, amongst others, and the pharmacological industry uses as others, but 50% of revenues generated from that will be transferred directly to the stewards of ecosystems in the countries where the data is taken from. It is currently voluntary, but it won't be always that way. And the deal here is that profits made from biotechnological research and genetic resources will now flow back to the communities, as I say, that have stewarded them. So this is transformational because, it represents a paradigm shift from exclusion to inclusion, so moves down from top-down conservation to co-governance. It involves moving from knowledge extraction to knowledge partnerships. So traditional ecological knowledge is now considered on a par with scientific expertise in these places. Transfer from economic exploitation to benefit sharing, and from more short-termism to more systemic change. This is really, really important. And why is it so important? Well, there's an overarching ethical imperative, clearly, to take the rights and knowledges of those people who have been living close to nature as part of nature for millennia into account. But there's also the three very practical reasons why this is important. And the first is, as you'll be aware, much of the world's biodiversity is protected within Indigenous territories. And we know from several analyses that rates of deforestation and degradation within the Indigenous territories is significantly lower than outside those territories. And this is partly reflecting the second reason, is that Indigenous and local ecological knowledge is a really important source of knowledge on how we work with nature, how we adaptively manage nature anyway, but is perhaps especially important in a rapidly warming world. This is a knowledge system that has been developed over millennia. through observation and experiments, much like Western ecology, but over much longer periods of time. And it can be vital for effective species conservation and, as I say, adaptive management. There are countless examples of where science has come together with local knowledge to enhance the conservation prospects of species all over the world. And the third reason is that many, not all, but many Indigenous peoples and local communities have what could be described as an ecocentric worldview or a kin-centric worldview. So this is a worldview that recognises the intrinsic value in ecosystems and the biological and physical elements that they comprise, as well as the ecological processes that spatially and temporally connect them. So that's a sort of more formal definition of what an ecocentric worldview is. But this is the idea that all beings are connected isn't just sort of a cultural idea, it's also scientific. So I'm an evolutionary biologist by training and an ecologist. And evolutionary biology has taught me that all species share a common ancestry. We are all kin. And ecology reveals how all these species interact in a web of life. These are the famous I Think sketches from Charles Darwin's notebook. In the 150, 200 years since that happened, we've developed very sophisticated ways of mapping out the evolutionary relationships between species and the networks that connect, of energy flow, that connect species living within ecosystems. So kinship and interrelatedness, these are ecological evolutionary ideas. They're also those ideas that many Eastern philosophical traditions and Indigenous communities share, seeing humans as stewards of nature rather than pests, conquerors or managers. This is a picture of Lila June, who is a woman from the First Nations woman in North America. She is a scientist, a poet, a scholar, an activist, a musician. She was speaking at our Nature-Based Solutions conference in June, and she had this beautiful quote that these human hands can be a blessing to the earth when guided by the right values and principles. So this kin-centric or ecocentric worldview, which sees humanity as part of a rich web of life, speaks to four guiding values that they talk are very common to many Indigenous knowledge systems, and these are the ones here. These are relationality, reciprocity, responsibility, and redistribution. The four R's. There are other R's, but these are very, I think, quite easy to remember. And they're all really important values, I think. Relationality recognises that all life forms are interconnected and the well-being depends on the health of the whole. So the well-being of an individual depends on the health of the whole. Reciprocity is a value around the need for mutual care between humans and ecosystems, giving back as much as we take, so making sure that there's balance there. Responsibility speaks to, long-term stewardship based on an ethical imperative to care for the environment and for future generations. So that's a responsibility that takes into account the needs and the well-being of future generations of both human and more than human forms. And redistribution is around, equitable sharing of responsibilities, fair access to the ecological and social benefits, equal representation, and so forth. So these are sort of like the four R's that connect those worldviews. And one can map different ecological disciplines, different core ideas in ecology and key ecological principles derived from Western science, map quite nicely onto each of these values. I'm not going to in the interest of time, read out everything that's on the slide here at all. But we can see how if we apply these ecological principles and these Indigenous and local knowledge value systems to nature-based solutions, we can kind of transform them in a really very helpful way, and in a way that can help transform society. So, for example, the reciprocity speaks to ecological principles of mutualism, resource sharing, nutrient cycling, and so forth. And this kind of moves the understanding of nature-based solutions beyond resource extraction and carbon commodification into more regenerative, balanced systems that can restore ecosystem health while supporting community livelihoods and so forth. Redistribution speaks to keystone species, trophic cascades, energy flow, concepts like that in ecology. And this value kind of centres equity and justice in nature-based solutions and encourages legal recognition of ecosystems and equitable payments, so systems like payment for ecosystem services and so forth. And I think this can be quite a useful exercise. So in terms of transforming, nature-based solutions, ecological science provides essential insights So landscape processes, feedback loops, resilience theory and so forth, and adaptive management to design effective nature-based solution. Indigenous and local knowledge brings a values-based approach rooted in relational thinking and ecocentric worldviews that ensures that nature-based solutions are equitable, culturally grounded and ethical and so forth. How am I doing for time? Timekeeper, doing okay. So just wanted to put a couple of examples, obviously very far from home, but hopefully this is of interest. So I wanted to take a little look, for example, at sort of what, in terms of nature-based solution, what responsibility in action might look like. And I think a really nice example is the Inuit-led Arctic Species Conservation Project. So Inuit communities in the Arctic have long practice responsible stewardship of species such as caribou and polar bears, seals and whales. They have developed adaptive knowledge systems over thousands of years, tracking the migration routes, understanding the population dynamics, and increasingly the climate impacts on populations of those species through close observation and through cultural traditions. You know, the Inuit, in terms of responsibility, the Inuit see themselves as guardians of Arctic ecosystems, guided by cultural obligations to care for species that they depend upon. And so the idea of responsibility is really deeply embedded in their cultural laws and passed through oral histories. This Inuit-led conservation programs also really emphasize the importance of ecological balance between predators and prey species, ensuring that prey populations are resilient to environmental change. And in terms of like adaptive management, the Inuit hunters and scientists together co-manage the bear populations under agreements based on both scientific data, so data derived from aerial surveys, drone surveys, satellite tracking and so forth, so quite high-tech scientific inputs, but they combine that with traditional knowledge, hunter observations of, as I said, what the migratory routes and how they're changing, as well as their observations on what's actually going on with the ice. So a lot of that local knowledge grounds some of the more remote technological approaches in a really powerful way. The idea of responsibility here is about caring for future generations. We see that the Inuit-led Arctic species conservation model shows that how long-term stewardship, constant monitoring, and this sort of culturally embedded sense of responsibility can result in quite successful, more resilient ecosystems that can adapt to climate change, whilst also supporting, the health and subsistence livelihoods. So that's one really nice example. And another one, also very far away, in fact, you can get further away than this one from where we are now, but it's a really, really interesting example. And actually, there's a growing movement, as you might be aware, around rights for nature and the granting of legal personhood to natural entities, either individual species, mountains, rivers, and so forth. Even it's increasingly coming closer to home. There's some amazing things going on rights for nature in Ireland, for example. This is one of the first in recent times. So this river, the Wanganui River, was granted legal personhood, and it was around in 2017, recognising the river as a living ancestor with legal rights. And this status redistributes power. So the local Maori tribes share legal guardianship with the government, ensuring a co-management system that's rooted in Indigenous and local knowledge. The river itself holds the same rights as a human, which is preventing or helping to prevent its exploitation. Both the government and the local Maori tribes have shared responsibility to care for the river's health, to ensure that it's not polluted, to ensure that the ecology is maintained and in good health. I think, this is, and from an ecological point of view, there's evidence around how keystone species within this ecosystem maintain the health balance, but also the granting the river of its legal personhood can really speaks to redistribution around redistributing power and rights and responsibilities between humans and ecosystems. And there are other examples of this around the world, but I think this is a really, really important one to highlight. So stepping back again, so going from the detail to the sort of the higher level, more global. So just over 10 years ago, the late amazing Professor Dame Georgina Mace, who is a dear friend and colleague of mine, she published a very seminal paper in Science called Who's Conservation, where she sort of set out sort of evidence that there were these four, broadly speaking, there were 4 broad frames of why we do conservation. Nature for nature's sake, nature despite people, nature for people, nature and people. And sort of since then, there's been a lot of work on sort of operationalizing and better understanding the nature and people framing, particularly work that's been done recently on the nature values framework by the the International Science to Policy Panel for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And I think these frames still coexist, so it's not like they replace one another. You know, different places and different times, these different types of frames are more or less useful. The problem is quite a lot of conservation, or in recent times, particularly in how the value of nature is understood, has sort of got stuck in this nature for people frame, so like the third frame of this, when actually we really need to, I think there's a really strong case, the need to see and get this fifth frame out there, this idea that we are nature, that we're part of nature, this idea that, as I say, resonates with ecology, evolutionary biology, and the worldviews of Indigenous people. And this builds a sense of responsibility and care, which I think is really important to highlight. Because, as I pointed out earlier, you know, it's very hard to tackle the challenges we face with the same mindset, with the same system that has caused the challenges in the first place. This was something that, you know, Albert Einstein highlighted, and other thinkers that follow. So I think it's important to start thinking maybe slightly differently, and sort of it's not. And trying to understand better how this framing around people as nature we might be able to percolate that through the system. In terms of like the key ideas underpinning the people as nature idea, in terms of things that I've alluded to, we could unpack more ideas around ecological complexity, ideas around relational values and interdependence, the importance of bridging, or even where relevant, integrating knowledge from Western ecology and Indigenous and local knowledge systems, and also the growing area of the ecology of nature reconnection. And I think wanting to talk a little bit, whilst also wrapping up, about this really important growing area of research around nature connection. And there's this beautiful quote by Arne Næss, the Norwegian philosopher who coined the term deep ecology, who said, "Care flows naturally if the sense of self is widened and deepened, that the protection of nature is felt and conceived of as the protection of our very selves." And so there's a lot of evidence showing that when people are involved in the process of restoring nature, maybe through the amazing projects that you're doing, the sort of community ecology ideas, they become closer to nature, they care more for it, they become more connected as a community, but they also become more connected for nature. And there is growing evidence too that the more connected we feel to nature, the more likely we are to make sustainable lifestyle choices, the more likely we are to maybe shift our diet, to join local conservation activities, to fly less, to basically consume less and live more sustainably. And there's also this sort of whole growing area of work where artists are starting to collaborate with ecologists to really lean into this work of how we reconnect nature amongst modern societies. Maybe many of you in the audience already feel very connected to nature and you don't need that, but many parts of Western society are desperately disconnected, leading to all sorts of crises. This crisis of separation, which is really compromising a sense of meaning, a sense of well-being, a sense of community. But there are different ways, and I know, as a scientist, I know that whilst the science is important, science alone can't reconnect people. We can't tell people that the science needs us to be reconnected and expect them to respond to that. However, we can use art or radical collaborations between artists and scientists and conservationists to try and make this societal shift that we need. What all this means to nature-based solutions. So coming back to that, in terms of the design of nature-based solutions, we need to design these interventions so that they reflect whole ecosystem dynamics. We need to think about, when it comes to financing, we need to think about the long-term ecological and social value rather than the short-term profits. When it comes to the governance, we need to think about empowering local communities. They may or may not be Indigenous, they may be naturalised, or might be farming communities, whatever they are, the local, those who are living close to nature as part of nature. And we need this much more systems approach. So understanding that nature-based solutions are not isolated short-term projects, but they're embedded within interconnected ecological and governance systems. There's all sorts of exciting and interesting areas of research to keep your eyes on. Work, as I say, looking at bridges between ecological science and Indigenous science, understanding nature connection, getting beyond carbon, scaling with integrity, and so forth. I think ecologists, I mean, I would say this as an ecologist myself, but I know there are many ecologists, whether formally or informally, in the room as well. I think we really do need to lean in with our ecological understanding of ourselves as part of nature into the conversations around global frameworks and the conversations that are going on as national and local policy for nature is evolved. And I think these citizens' assemblies that were mentioned at the beginning are a really important thing to really get behind and engage with, because that's our opportunity to try and have our understanding and our knowledge and our love of nature permeate through into the more national and international conversations. Okay, so key messages. Diverse knowledge systems are needed to get humanity onto a sustainable trajectory. I believe an ecology and conservation biology and knowledge from practice that we have, or you have certainly, can play a critical role. I believe that nature-based solutions can help transform society if guided by both ecological principles and the values that emerge from a more kin-centric or ecocentric worldview, to expand them beyond purely instrumental to being relational, regenerative and equitable. And as I say, we need to apply existing ecological knowledge, but we also need to deepen our collaborations and make more radical collaborations across disciplines and sectors. Okay, thank you very much.
I'm going to be really thinking about this concept of kinship. That's a really interesting way of thinking about the world and how we can take our local community activity here and see how it scales up to a UK and to a world view. So thank you so much for your presentation. We do have some time for some questions. And what I'd like to do actually is invite Camilla and David on up to, we've got enough seats, so I'm sure we can wiggle another seat, because we have three super experts. Let's make full use of them. A question?
Yes, I loved the sentence where you said the current economic system is actively investing in its own demise. I mean, when I say loved, that's obviously I didn't buy it, but it's just such a clear expression. And I just wondered, from an academic point of view, whether you feel that your colleagues in economics departments are beginning to wake up, or whether undergraduates arriving at Oxford now to do PE is still being introduced to extractive understandings of what economics is.
It's a really great question, and I think Oxford University is a very diverse and heterogeneous place, and I've got colleagues that are really out, you know, really trying to really understand what a regenerative, life-enabling economy would look like. And are teaching their students that, but there are other colleagues that are, have a more traditional view and are very worried about what's going on with our economies globally, and are still using and teaching some of the older framings. So it's a mix.
And we've had this quote from Camilla saying that there are 23 million tonnes of carbon in Oxfordshire soil stored. Is that with all our fenlands, or is it not with all our fenlands with their peat that can be 3 metres deep, Camilla?
Yes, I'm not entirely sure. I'll have to go and check that.
I
So
have a feeling that it might be an awful lot more, because this particular area, this Oxford Heights West, the Corallian Ridge, is home to our really rare peat accumulating spring-fed fenlands, which may have up to 3 metres of peat accumulated over 10,000 years. And a lot of them are drying out due to drainage, climate change, whatever. And a lot of them are being restored. And a good nature-based solution is to put money into the restoration of areas that are drying up from drainage and peat extraction and so on. and then get them contributing by generating fresh carbon storage in peat, sequestering. So I don't hear enough about this. Freshwater Habitats Trust is leading the charge on this, finding we have more and more fen sites in Oxfordshire we didn't even know we had. We didn't have any trees drying out. We've got a peat store which we could restore to active carbon sequestering communities with huge biodiversity. So I would really like to hear more of it. I wonder if you had thought about this as a comment to add in your talk, which was excellent. But I'm not hearing enough about it. I'm hearing a lot about tree planting as carbon storage. Trees have a limited life, 200 years, 400 years, 600 for an oak, after which they rot, decay, and return their CO2 to the air. You store peat underground, and if you keep it wet enough, it's there for millennia. And it's a very safe way to store peat. And there are lots of figures now about the fact that only 30 or 40 centimetres of peat can hold more carbon than in all the trees in a tropical rainforest. That's because the rainforest soils are rather low in storage of carbon. It's all in the trees. And what I want to see is this sort of accepted along with tree planting's good. Carbon storage in soils can be safer than trees, which die from tree diseases and which can burn down into wildfires, you know. I wonder if you could see any way and that we can be doing more of this kind of recognition of soils, peatlands, restoration involving those.
Yeah, wetlands and all, they need more PR, don't they? I think trees have got all the good PR. And you need to have, you know, if you're going to do tree planting, the right tree in the right place. And of course, that's why, you know, we offer advice on the full suite of options available for nature recovery. And it's not all about tree planting at all. But yeah, creating wetlands, fen restoration. Yes, exactly. In the right place and the right types, you know, and hedgerows and orchards and things like that. But yeah, so important to actually to think about all of the options. And we're also really lucky to have Freshwater Habitats Trust in Oxfordshire. So they obviously have all the brilliant information on that.
Nathalie, do you want to say something about?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is abundant evidence, at least globally, like actual evidence with numbers, which is what's often needed, unfortunately, to sort of switch to, you know, decision makers and to shape policy on the value of peatlands. In the UK, in the new carbon budget that was released last week, peatland targets were in there. So it's recognised. So it's like trees, plant, you know, native woodland plantations and peatland restoration, which is good. So it is actually being acknowledged now, you know, amongst policymakers. I think in the UK, most policymakers that I speak to, and certainly when I talk to DEFRA, everyone's very, very much aware of how important peat is, particularly for the UK. We have some incredibly important peat bogs across in these isles, right? And I think that's generally recognised. But getting it into the models that then inform the national and international targets, that's quite hard because we still need to do more research to quantify some of those benefits in order to feed some of the more reductive modelling approaches that unfortunately we have to make work. But I hear you. But I think from my conversations, people know and recognise it, but it doesn't.
In Oxfordshire, Vale and districts have, for the first time ever, got recognition of the fens and their peatland stock in the plan that is going forward. It's not final yet, but this is a real first in that recognition of the importance of the fens and spring fens and their peat stock in planning system.
So it's happening.
With consideration of the fact they have a catchment which will feed water, and then that's sensitive.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Thank you. And I guess that's going to be part of the local nature recovery strategy as a biodiversity hotspot and picked up at a county level as well.
Yeah, certainly that, yeah. I'm sure Judy did contribute to the local nature recovery strategy consultation, and all of those 2,000 comments are being gone through at the moment, and that's why the final version is going to be published in autumn 2025, because there were so many responses, and we want to make sure that we've got the time to properly go through them all and take them into account. So yes.
There's been a lot to absorb, and thank you for 3 fascinating talks. And my question is really, how do we translate this down into the curriculum, particularly for the younger generation, and also the local communities? We don't have ILKs in this country. I don't suppose. I mean, we do in some areas, but it's a question of building that into the curriculum. How is that being done? Is there a way of doing that? So we engender responsibility in younger people and a knowledge of how that responsibility actually can help them in their lives, both in their choices and their futures.
Excellent, thank you. Perhaps I can take my role as the MD to sort of pick up on this concept about how we can learn from Indigenous cultures in a UK-wide context, and how does a local community working in a parish council in Oxfordshire, what can we learn from the New Zealand and Inuit people?
Well, exactly. I mean, I think that's why when we're working in a particular area, we always encourage the parish council to talk to the community nature group, to include the gardening group, to include the climate action group, to include the local church or other faith areas, to include the local schools, so that you're bringing together whatever the different parts of the community are, bringing them all together to work on creating a plan for nature, which can be part of a neighbourhood plan or can be a separate kind of plan for nature, and then to actually involve all of those people in actually creating that nature and managing it as well. So it's, as Nathalie said earlier, it's about if the people are actually involved in doing that, then they're much more likely to well, firstly, you've given those people skills, you create a sense of community cohesion, and also there's lots of research that shows that once people are more connected with nature, they make more sustainable choices. So it sort of has all these wonderful knock-on effects. And of course, another really important sort of group of people to involve in when you're creating space for nature at the local scale is, the farmers and landowners of the land that might be surrounding the village as well. So including them in an inclusive way, because it's and when we go out to talk to a local community or to talk to a farmer or landowner, we bring our ecological knowledge and we bring the information that we have from the Environmental Record Centre of what species and habitats there are in the area, but that's a small part of it. What was also really important is that we listen to the people who live in the village, the farmers who own the land, and are farming the land, on how are they using the land and what else have they found. And quite often they'll say, well, we know there's lots of these other things, those aren't on the records. And then we can say, brilliant, well, why don't you share that information with the Record Centre and then it will be on the records. So we're always learning and listening and collaborating with local people, and I think that's incredibly important because we've got the ecological knowledge, but they've got the local knowledge, and that combining the two is the best thing. And I think specifically on the schools point, there has been some work nationally that's also been led by some people at the University of Oxford on sort of nature schools, and I got it wrong, but that's my word for it. We do have a little bit of information about that on our website for schools and educators, which guides them towards that. So I think involving young people as another group of people is also really, really important, and I think more needs to be done. I think in the recent past, forest schools are brilliant and have been really successful, but there was a kind of misconception that nature's just for young children, and once you even get to age 8, it's not for you anymore. So I think we need to kind of continue that nature connection and education with all ages.
Excellent.
There's just to pick up on the education thing. There's this extraordinary thing that happens with nature connectedness, with or without forest schools, but bolstering the initial thing. I mean, most children are born deeply connected and part of nature and love nature. And then that transition in this country and globally actually is called the teenage dip. And some just fall off and they never come back. Some come back in contact with nature, but not until their late 20s. So it's this extraordinary thing that happens. So something is happening there. And actually, there's now quite a big movement to not only try and understand what drives that dip, but also then how to repair it and ensure that at least that more are being pulled across. So it's more of a lifelong learning and lifelong nature connection. But nature-centric education is like a kind of an area of work that is becoming that more and more of us are leaning into, because I absolutely agree. It's not just simply, although it was a great achievement to have an optional natural history GCSE, there's nowhere near enough. And actually bringing kids and doing outside into nature, actually learning from nature, so using nature as teacher, nature as teacher is becoming is more an important thing. But just on the Indigenous thing, when we talk about Indigenous people, in the UK often the reaction is, but that doesn't apply to us, we don't have Indigenous people. It's a funny term, I mean, we have a lot of nature-loving and nature-connected people in this country that have a lot of important local knowledge. And so using that term, don't want to exclude that. In fact, we want to have an inclusive approach as possible. And I think exactly what you said, it's like bringing all those knowledge holders together and listening and bringing that knowledge and sort of tapping into a bit of, there are lots of movements and lots of organisations now and more reading and podcasts and things on this very point about what does nature connection look like from a UK perspective, and what techniques, what rituals, what interactions with nature where we live can really help bring that and build community at the same time. And then how do we bring that into schools? But this is actually quite a really interesting movement that's happening in the UK and elsewhere, where we feel like we've lost our indigeneity, but we still love nature and want to be reconnected.
David wanted to come in?
Yes, I mean, if I might make first an observation and then actually move towards a question for Nathalie as well. But the observation goes back to the first question, who asked about how the current generation of economic students might see the world. And I think that question and the answer to it resonates through all the other conversation we've had. And I'd like to point out, first of all, that over a generation, there's been a transformation in what it is to be a conservation biologist, such as we have in our speaker today. There was a time when conservationists were thought to be essentially zoologists or botanists. They wore muddy boots, had barber jackets. Some of them even had beards. These are people who went out into the field and were in a certain sort of perhaps inspirationally informed and knowledgeable silo. And there was other people who did economics or public health or education or things of that sort. The modern conservation biologist, of which I have one sitting on my right, is somebody who I think goes beyond a merging of those things, because we all are now familiar with the butterfly effect. The famous butterfly in Hong Kong bats its wings and the weather changes here. We're aware of holism, the same sort of holistic appreciation that is also familiar to the indigenous peoples and their cultures that we've been talking about. So the modern conservation biologist is really more of a citizen than anything else, because that person understands the linkages between ecology and biology and evolution and economics and the law and politics and development and even ethics. And I'd like to mention ethics at this point, really to support what Nathalie was saying, because not only is there an evolutionary web of life and an economic integration between all of our activities, but there's a fundamental question about how we see ourselves ethically with respect to the wider kingdoms of nature. Do humans alone have intrinsic value and deserve consideration and care as a consequence, or do other elements of nature have intrinsic value and therefore deserve similar care? And I think my own position, if I could put it, I think resonates with the talk we've heard today, is to be what I would call a non-anthropocentrist. I think that people are not the centre. Nature is a whole. And if I could finish this little diatribe talking about whether there's indigenous or indigenous knowledge in this country, and even at the moment. I talked just in my few welcoming remarks, which hardly constitute a talk, but about the work we've done on farmland over decades here. And for many of those decades, we found it very helpful to study wood mice as an interesting organism that was small enough to therefore be numerous and studyable, but large enough to be radio trackable and so forth. So we could learn through wood mice about nature on farmland. And that reminds me, back to indigenous knowledge, I come from Scotland, to Robbie Burns's famous poem about the wee sleek Curin Timorous Beastie, the one that he held in his hands, having ploughed up its nest in the 1780s. Burns was at the time a farmer. Now, almost everybody knows the opening line of that poem, even the first verse. The second verse is worth us considering in this context, because Burns, as he held this quivering wood mouse in his hand, lamenting the fact that his plough had destroyed its home, looked at the mouse and said, "I'm truly sorry man's dominion has broken nature's social union and justifies that ill opinion you have of me, your poor earthborn companion and fellow mortal." And I think as a matter of ethics and intrinsic values, that's a thought that we might have in mind when talking about some of these things. I've spoken too much, but I did have a question.
I think we'll allow David to ask a question.
My question was that, Nathalie, you several times in your talk, and very compellingly, talked about changes that a new appreciation and understanding, or a revived old appreciation and understanding of nature might have. And you used the word shift, a shift in opinion, a shift in policy, quite often. It's a good word. I wondered, as we look to the sort of changes you're hoping for, insofar as the word shift might imply some sort of change on a continuum, if that can deliver solutions, or whether you need a switch to an entirely different sort of system, and if so, how that's to be accomplished.
It's a good question, isn't it? I mean, for me, shift is maybe slightly more abrupt than your interpretation of the word shift.
Yes.
I mean, we needed, transformation is a better word, I think. And we do need to transform our economy. But that transformation involves a mixture of some quite radical shifts with more gradual ones. We can't go from where we are now to where we need to be by tomorrow. When we need some sort of just transition. But there are low-hanging fruits. There are things that are actually easy for us to do as individuals and communities that we should just be getting on with. There is a bit more of a shift towards a plant-based diet, a shift towards flying less, a shift towards consuming less, a shift to, those are shifts versus, but you add those up and you get something that looks more like transformation.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you.
Excellent. I'm going to squeeze in one more question. I'm going to go to Sian. I'm going to come and stand over here.
Hello, I'm Sian Levitsky. I've been a great supporter of Wild Oxfordshire for many years, and I understand the value that nature has to all of us locally in Oxfordshire. But I would like to turn to our speakers who have international knowledge, and I'm going to ask the dirty question now. With this, I'm so glad there is now a more nuanced understanding of nature-based solutions and a more cultural shift in this approach. However, I also wonder whether, as ecologists and people passionate about it, we have not been vocal enough at the governance end. I just wonder whether we should be training ecologists to be politicians, politicians to understand science, and the dirty word lobbying. How do you guys in your life feel that we are affecting things at the top end where they seem so divorced from how we feel here today?
There we go. There's a good final question for our panel. Who is going to start off with that one? Well, Nathalie, you are a speaker.
I might start with saying I hear you about getting ecologists into these spaces. And that's sort of what I was alluding to by the green Trojan horse idea. It's like once you've got a concept there, warts and all, you can then unpack that by ensuring that you get that ecology. And I think it's a lack of ecology and a lack of ecological thinking, which has results in this commodification and incrementalism and so on. So I think ecological training for decision makers, and I'm actively involved. Oxford University has lots of what we call executive education programs, and some of those are really trying to can we get decision makers into these spaces, whether on the public or the private sector, to have them better understand what a healthy ecosystem is. It's not just a bunch of trees, it's a well-restored peatland, or whatever that might be. So I think, and those are starting to be effective, right? So getting ecologists into those spaces and then training the decision makers in the principles of ecology, and providing, in terms of leveraging at a high level, I have seen quite a transformation. As I say, it's now reasonable to present ecological data in the treasuries of the world. We are wanted. Our knowledge is wanted. What then happens is another question. But at least the door is now open, at least we are able to share that understanding. But clearly there are, I would say there's so much evidence now feeding into the economic sense of restoring and working with nature, that we can't have a flourishing economy without flourishing ecosystems. But even in the presence of all that data supporting what I've just said, still people aren't listening. It's still business as usual. And there's lots of vested interests in the system. And as the old system starts to quake and the system starts to break down, so those in power continue to cling and continue not to listen to that, which is why a pivot towards working in our schools, nature-centric education, empowering individuals. We have political theatre and chaos, but we have the resilience and the brilliance of the local communities. And that's where I feel like a lot of our effort needs to be, to build agency at the individual and community level, because what goes on is dictated by history, power imbalances, dark forces that we as individuals can't speak into, but we can just get on with the good stuff we know we need to do that makes us happy, that's good for the more than human world on which we depend and which we love. So if we just get on with that and build that resilience, and all this is going on up here, I think that's what we have to do. And I do have some faith that will ultimately help us transform into a world that nourishes the web of life.
Excellent, thank you. So I'm going to put you on the spot here. When people leave today, if there's one thing that you would like them to remember from your talk and tell their friends and family about, what's that one thing?
I think continue doing all this amazing work you're doing at the local level. Like bring your communities together through caring for that which you love. And you're already doing that. You're already doing that. So for this particular audience, it feels like just keep going with the beautiful stuff. Know that what you're doing will have the butterfly effect, will have that ripple effect. Even when it feels like, you're just beavering away on Oxfordshire, and what difference is it going to make? It makes all the difference in the world. You heal yourselves, heal your communities and your families as you heal landscapes. And then share that knowledge. Share that around. That's all.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And thank you very much for coming. Let's give our speakers a round of applause.